John Macnaughtan has spent a lifetime in the cycle industry, most of it with Raleigh. His early career was spent in Africa and the Middle East. He was instrumental in setting up Raleigh Australia and then spent 27 years with Sturmey-Archer. This was followed by a long period travelling the world whilst managing Raleigh International. Along the way, and independently of Raleigh, he helped ensure Brooks remained a British-based company. Today he is co-owner of Pashley and spends much of his time working at the Moulton Bicycle Company in Bradford-on-Avon. That's where I recorded the following interview. John Macnaughtan's surname suggests Scottish roots, so I started off by asking him where he was born and raised. However, it wasn't north of the border.
Well, like many Scots, we were overseas and were running the colonies at the time. So yes, I was brought up in Burma, but the Japanese happened to be occupying it when I should have been born in Rangoon. So I was emerged in Calcutta. Scotland and Burma were very close, actually. The English tended to be more in India, I would say, but the Scots pretty much colonised Burma, and some of the Scottish companies, the Bombay Burma Company and the Irrawaddy Flotilla Company, the largest inland waterway in the history of the world, was totally Scottish. And very interesting too, just to sort of see the growth of things like that, because South Island in New Zealand was very Scottish, and some of the ships used to go from Glasgow down to Dunedin, not just with people but goods, but coming back empty, and that was where they used to pop in halfway to pick up goods that on routes that weren't very well travelled, and one of those was, of course, in Burma. So the ships would stop there and collect teak, rice, semi-precious stones from what is a very wealthy country, and hence the growth there. So my dad was in shipping, and he went out there in 1932, and my granddad went out there originally in 1926, and he was the harbour master there on my mother's side. And so we were very much involved with Burma from 1920s and 30s and until we were kicked out in independence. I was at the little local convent school there, and I think I was 6 when I came back initially to Scotland, my relatives up there, and then down to London. My mother's side were Londoners. So, and Dad came back in 1950, actually. Independence was in 47 when Mum and I, roughly speaking, left. And then, yes, in 1950, Dad came back, and he didn't go into the shipping company. Glasgow was not an easy place, shall we say, after the war. And sadly, then things declined, and the Scotsmen who were running the Irrawaddy Flotilla Company started an egg poultry business in the south of England, which had been very successful. And so we were there, and I was schooled and brought up in Kent.
So this was obviously a very different lifestyle to that which you'd been accustomed to in Calcutta, I imagine.
Totally. In fact, I remember my mum used to love, as a child, going to Broadstairs, and I was taken, at the age of 6 or 7, to one of these seaside review shows, and I was of the age that we were asked, anyone of our age, to ask to go on the stage. And I remember we were asked to go on the stage, and we had to sing a song. Now, the only song I knew happened to be in Burmese. And I hasten to add, I don't speak Burmese now, but my nanny, who I think was a Karen girl, but taught me this song. And I remember standing up in Broadstairs without a smile on my face, belting out this Burmese song, and nobody clapped afterwards. It scarred me for life. Anyway, yes, I was different.
Very good. As a child, did you have a bicycle?
No, not really. I was late getting a bicycle. It was fairly tough, the war. My grandfather, who we lost, both sides of the family lost everything, and there was no recompense, of course. So, in fact, funnily enough, the house that I was brought up in Burma and have memories of is now the British Ambassador's house in Burma. And my 3rd birthday was on the tennis court of that house, which I went back to visit in 1995. Anyway, when we left, of course, we literally came back in the clothes we were wearing. So a bike would have been a real luxury.
So did you get a bike by the time you were a teenager?
Yes, and I'm trying to recall, because I went, in fact, to boarding school. And the reason I went to boarding school is interesting because many people have, how should we say, thoughts about boarding school and public schools. But when my dad came back, we were put up in a pub. So there were three of us, my mum, dad and myself, living in a pub in Wye, in Kent, in the village. And my dad decided very quickly this was not a good place for a child to be brought up. And actually I was sent to boarding school literally on a bank overdraft. So I went to have extremely good education in those terms, but it was pretty hard come by. So it was all done on an overdraft. So a bicycle was the last thing. In fact, I remember a pair of roller skates on my 9th birthday. That was the first introduction I had to anything on wheels. And I was a dab hand at that. But a bike did come, I think, when I was about 12. And but I can't remember it because we then moved when I was 13 to Tunbridge Wells, and it was more sort of city-like. And I must say that, again, I didn't cycle very much.
It was just a means of getting from A to B locally, I guess.
Not even that. I used to walk into town, and it was in the shed. Sorry to tell you this, having had a life in bicycles, so I'm not a good advert.
What was your original intention for a career, John?
I was one of the first students, sadly enough, at Sussex University. Oh. So when it actually the first year it opened, and I was really very keen to get there. And I didn't know what I wanted to do or be, and that's why I went to university, because it seemed to delay and prolong the agony of having to decide to earn something. And I'll be quite honest, my last year there, where I was thinking about what am I going to do, I thought, I know what's going to be best for me. I'll go into the Foreign Office. Oh. But despite my knowledge of childhood Burmese, while I passed the civil service exams, I failed on my languages, and what's more, a music test I was given at St James's for aptitude for languages, which was pretty humiliating. Oh. So I didn't get into the Foreign Office, and then panicked, I then went for what seemed at the time, but by present standards wasn't a lot, masses of interviews with companies who had the graduate trainee courses. That seemed to me a good idea because it again seemed to delay the opportunity of making up my mind what to do by being further trained. And I went to BP, I went to several, London, and one of the ones I went to was Tube Investments. Uh-huh. I knew very little about engineering. I knew less about Tube Investments, but funnily enough, the chappie running it there, and I can't recall his name, he was governor of Malaya. Anyway, he interviewed me, and I thought, what a wonderful worldly man, and I really took to his whole raison d'etre for creating this, and I joined TI, Tube Investments, on their graduate trainee scheme, and for the first time went to Birmingham, which was more of a culture shock than being in India or Burma, I have to hasten to add, because before I knew Scotland and I knew Kent. So I joined TI and not the Foreign Office, and decided very early on that I wanted to be in TI Export, which was in 5 ways, Birmingham. And to my horror, found out after I started on my engineering course in Chance Technical College that they were only taking on metallurgists and engineers. Ah. And I'd studied history. So not considered relevant to the real world. And I was put onto the consumer side of TI, which was at the time Creeder cookers. I'm trying to remember the different ones, but obviously Raleigh. So I went up to Raleigh, and I was then, it was a 2-year course, and we were at Aston. It was before it was made into university, Tech College or something, to do a diploma of management, which was actually very good. I mean, incredible transition, really, from doing an academic subject like history to doing something, business administration and all of that. It was very lucky and wonderful because we, with TI, they owned about 100 different companies in all parts of the West Midlands. We went to visit a lot of them, and I got a very good appreciation into certainly engineering, into the whole of the West Midlands and further, and at the same time going back with a bunch of lads and learning the theory of everything. So and I was steered towards Raleigh, so I finished my 2-year course to get my what was it called, Diploma of Management, and I can tell you my impression of TI and of Raleigh. I decided very much that this was not the world for me, and I thought, well, I'll do these 2 years and then quietly say thank you and leave. That was my intention.
What was the date of this?
1965, we're talking, yes. And I emerged into the world of work. The story is quite interesting because I had written out actually the night before my letter of resignation. I'd done my course and I went for my interview at Raleigh to see the job that I was going to be offered. And I remember a chap called Jimmy Cumming, an exceptional man, one of the T. Lawrences of this world. He was born in Zanzibar, spoke perfect Kikuyu, Swahili, of course, and what a gent, spoke Arabic, lovely character. And I remember going in to see this rather ascetic gentleman, and he said, "Come in, John." He said, "Now sit down." And I had my letter of resignation, so I thought, well, I'll listen to him for a couple of minutes and then say, well, thank you, but no thank you. And I remember him scratching his head now as I can picture myself there. And he said, do you know, he said, I don't know what to do with people like you. He said, there's these new personnel departments with which inflicted upon us by management. He said that they've come up with this scheme to bring in graduate trainees, and he said, you're not fit for anything, and if you're any good at all, you'll leave, and if you're no good, you're going to waste everybody's time for a few years till we find you out. So he said, I really don't know what to do with you. And he said, you'll never learn anything in this company. It's far too big. You'll get lost in it, and we will lose track of you. And he said, and I've been asked to place you. And he said, so it's an impossible job for me. And he said, I said, in fact, I've thought about this, and I've decided the only way you'll learn anything, and we'll certainly learn about you, is to send you to one of our overseas companies, and I will get a report on who you are and what you are. Now, do you prefer Madras or Johannesburg? And my jaw dropped, of course, and I said I didn't have a preference between Madras or Johannesburg. And he proceeded to write to TI India and to Raleigh Cycles South Africa, explaining that they wanted to give me an induction course to train me up, and we would make a decision after a year of who I was, what I was, and whether I was worth employing, and vice versa. So with that, I went home, and I was staying in a bed and breakfast lodgings. And I said to Jimmy Cumming, what should I do now? And he said, well, I don't want your face to appear in these offices. You've just wasted everybody's time chatting. So he said, I want you to check in. And he said, you'll come in and you'll talk to my secretary and check in every day. And I said, well, how long will it take? Well, we'll send a telex or whatever it was, they said. And so he said, you pop in. Well, of course, I couldn't stay at home because it was bed and breakfast. Mm-hmm. So I was literally walking the streets. I got to know Nottingham very well. and sure enough, in about 10 days, later, I was booking up, and I was on a flight to Johannesburg and into Springs in the Transvaal.
Gosh.
So that was, and I was, my letters, I don't know where that letter's gone to, actually. It's probably still in the jacket pocket.
South Africa was the crucible of the merger between the TI group and Raleigh, and you had De Gingon down there, and all that sort of thing, and his liaison with Wilson. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's very humbling talking to you, Tony, because I must remember your knowledge is deeper than mine, and I can only give sort of little personal quips. But it really was, because actually there were two factories, because the two enemies were Phillips and Hercules versus Raleigh Industries. And of course it was a reverse takeover. It was, of course, TI that bought Phillips, the British bicycling companies, but they centred it, rightly or wrongly, on Nottingham, which was the Raleigh factory. Well, exactly the same happened in South Africa. Raleigh had its factory in Vereeniging, and Phillips had its factory in Springs in the Transvaal, and they closed the Vereeniging factory, which was actually a fabulous bicycle factory. I went to see it out of interest, and it really was designed as a sort of mini Nottingham, properly laid out, whereas the Phillips factory was much more versatile. There were lines put out, but much easier to change.
Right.
And it was quite interesting to see the mentality of the two different companies, quite different people. And I got to see that later on when I saw the people from Phillips that were merged into Raleigh from the people from Raleigh, who were there, and they were quite different animals. It was this wonderful difference we have in Britain. They were very much Birmingham people, the West Midlands, whereas the Nottingham people were East Midlands people, and they were a different breed. And I was a total outsider, of course, so could be friends with both. But you're absolutely right. And then TI, of course, South Africa, that was where Freddie Dingengang that you mentioned, and one or two other notables. When I went to South Africa there, it was mainly people by Raleigh people, actually, from Nottingham. And the managing director, I say this for a reason that we'll come on to, was a chap called Jack Catling, and he was a bachelor. He used to ride to work on his Raleigh Roadster 28-inch wheel bicycle. He was a man that he always had half an inch of cuff there, handkerchief in his pocket, tie, and he would ride in his Sturmey-Archer gear, tied down into first gear, rode very slowly into work every morning. And I remember you were not allowed to wear brown shoes. You weren't allowed to. You had to be dressed in a certain way, becoming of being a Raleigh person. But the interesting reason telling you though, Jack Catling was a bachelor. That was the first time I met Alex Moulton, who at the time, also a bachelor, and of course, he was trying to suggest that Raleigh South Africa made the Moulton bicycle, not this dreadful RSW 16 that was being imposed upon them.
Yes.
Jack Catling liked the idea of not being the colonies being run from Whitehall, so he, of course, chose the Moulton bicycle and not the Raleigh one, and felt great pride in so doing. That was a silly story.
You had this very strange situation, didn't you, where the war was going on between Raleigh with the RSW and Moulton with his bike, and yet that subsidiary of Raleigh in South Africa was making the Moulton under licence.
Yes.
And also badge engineering it with other names, which was extraordinary. We have a letter which shows it being badged as a Hercules and various other names.
Well, they had to do that, you see, for their distribution arrangements. I remember when I arrived in there, Mick Keller was the commercial director, and he said to me, I got a lecture when I got there about what I couldn't do in apartheid South Africa. Don't mess with the black girls. Don't do this, don't do. And he gave me a a list of books. And he said, first week here, he said, I want you to read these books. And he gave me 7 books to read. The one I remember most was Goodbye Dolly Gray on the Boer War. And the reason I mention that is my impressions of South Africa is this was January 1967. My impressions of South Africa were, I was very open to everything, but my impressions were clouded by something I'll come back to for a minute. But he said to me, I'm not interested in your views. I don't want to know how you do it until you've read these 7 books. Then I met Jack Catling, and he turned around and said to me something similar. And he said, look, he said, you're coming here to be trained, and you're not coming here to tell us how to do anything. And he said, I know very well that in England you've got these fancy ideals of now factories dealing direct with their dealers. He said, we go through wholesalers. Our job is to make bicycles. That's what we know how to do. Their job is to do the distribution.
Right.
That's how they know it. So we have manufacturer, wholesalers, dealers. And he said, I don't want to know your opinion. He said, you will go and find out, and then you will come to me in 6 months' time. And you're not worth talking to till then. So I went away and I read I did read these books in a week. And I read, and Goodbye Dolly Gray stuck in my mind, because I realised then how the whole social structure of South Africa hadn't really changed much from after the Boer War. The Boers really had farming and politics. The Brits were very much in commerce and industry, and the Jews were very much in trade and the finance side. And that's how it was. So Raleigh was a microcosm of this. Raleigh had its factory and made bicycles and sold to all the Jewish wholesalers, and each of them had their own brand. So Akel's in Durban would have the Raleigh brand, and I can't remember, Cape Cycles would have the Phillips brand, somebody else would have the Hercules brand. But they had about 10, 12 brands in South Africa. Ray, I can't remember them all now, but they had these brands, and so as a result, Raleigh was controlling its own competition, and they sold, of course, throughout. And I went to actually work. I spent a little time in Springs, but I went to work with a lot of the wholesalers and went round with the wholesalers' reps. I recorded at the time, from leaving England to getting back in a year, I covered 32,000 miles. Gosh. So I really did. Well, I'll tell you an interesting story, and I was just recalling now. It so happened that I was at university with one Tabu Mbeki, and his father, as you know, was one of those involved with the Rivonia trials, blowing up Johannesburg Station. And so I remember Tabu, who, when he first arrived in Brighton, and he arrived late, and he had nowhere to stay, and I was in my second year, and I remember having a spare room in our flat. And I was asked by the housing officer, whatever, if I would put Tabu up. And I didn't know him from Adam. And he arrived late. And he was a Communist Party member. Now, the interesting thing was, I used to get there was three of us sharing a flat. And then Tabu came in. And I used to get sort of a letter a week, perhaps. But every morning, he would have a torrent of letters through the letterbox, and it was blimmin' annoying because we used to have to look through and, of course, found there was nothing for us. And then Tabu, who had his own metabolism, would have these meetings in our flat, of course. So after one term, we had to ask him, I hope very politely, to remove himself, which is quite fun to look at. But one of the things he did when his dad came up for trial, I must say that I didn't get involved in politics at a particular university, although in those days Sussex was a very political university. But I remember when he arranged a walk from London to Brighton, because the chances were that his dad would be found guilty along with the others, and it was capital punishment, of course, for that. And I remember Tabu actually came to my flat and said to me, John, he said, I know you don't get involved in these things, but I would like you to join this walk. And I said, well, I'm doing it because of your dad. If it was my dad, I said, I don't approve of what he did. I don't agree with what his actions were, but he's your dad, Tabu. So in fact, it's the only walk I've been on demonstrating in my life. And I went walked. Then when I went to Cape Town, I thought, gosh, here I am. I'm in Cape Town now for 6 weeks. I better... I should jolly well go and look up Tabu's dad, Govan Mbeki. And so I went to the local police station and I said, excuse me, I said, I just happen to be here. I wonder, is it possible to go to Robben Island and visit? And I said, all I want to do is just say hello. I was at university with his son for a couple of years and tell him he's well, and that's it. I don't, just courtesy. And the policeman in a thick boer, anyway, he said... he took my particulars and all the rest of it, and to be honest, I'd forgotten about it. Then was with my wholesale reps going up to Namakwa Land or somewhere, meeting all the dealers. A week later, I got a telephone call from Jack Catling. Absolutely said, now look here, Macnaughtan, you do not get involved in politics in this country. I've just had the police on the phone from Cape Town, and he said, if I hear from this again, you're out of the country. And I spluttered and I said, but look, I don't want to hear anything more about this. Do you hear what I've said? Well, there's nothing more to provoke you, of course. And I thought, right. And then I became a human being again. And I thought, bastards, they're not going to tell me what to do. Do you know the sad thing, and I regret it to this day, I got my approval to visit Robben Island, and I'm sure it wasn't by coincidence. I got it the week, the last week I left, or the first week after I had left Cape Town. Oh. So I never did get to Robben Island. Oh my God. Anyway, sorry.
Wonderful story.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Anyway, when I came back from South Africa, in fact, Jimmy Cumming came out and I met him. I went up into Rhodesia, as it beautifully was then, and what a relief. I mean, crossing that border, this must have been end of 67, from South Africa, which has all its silliness of apartheid and all this, but you go into Rhodesia and it was like taking your coat off. It was much more relaxed. The atmosphere between the different tribes and there was so great, and I thought, what a lovely country. And I happened to have relatives, funny enough. My father's cousins, my second cousin was the bank manager of Barclays Bank in Salisbury, and his brother was a farmer in Bulawayo, and was coming over from Beira, and I'd met him by accident, funnily enough, in Durban, purely by accident, and he was staying at the same hotel, and there was a phone call, and I for Macnaughtan. Well, it's not a common name. And I met him in the lift going down to take the phone call, and he said, I think that's for me. It was my second cousin. Anyway, so I went up to Rhodesia, saw some of my family there, and, do you know, just a gorgeous country and seemed so peaceful and happy. And I went up from there to Malawi, and again, lovely, very poor country. Most of the people go to work in the mines, as you know, in South Africa. But it was such that, and Africa got under my skin about then. And then I went down to Zambia, which was different again, much more oppressive, funnily enough. And there I met some Raleigh people who'd come out, Jimmy Cumming amongst them. And I was involved then with the whole British. We were looking at building a factory in Zambia and so on. And I got to, and I must admit, being talked to as though I was some expert, whereas really I was just a very naive young trainee. Whatever age I was, I didn't know. And so from when I came back from South Africa, it was just assumed that I was a member of the export department, and I must say I long since forgotten my little letter in my pocket, and I had assumed I would have some role. And the very first job I had was in 1967, you'll remember, was the Six-Day War in Israel.
Yeah.
The anniversary of that, Raleigh, that they were chucking out, or to celebrate this anniversary, all the Arab countries nearby were throwing out any English and American goods. And Raleigh had lost, in inverted commas, 35,000 bicycles. Oh. And Jimmy Cumming called me in and said, now, Macnaughtan, I've got a little job for you. He said that you should be, after your South African experience, which I don't think is relevant, but still, I want you to locate these 35,000 bicycles. You will find them, you will get them all there, and you will go about and sell them. He said some may be in the sea, we don't know. Some could be at other ports. They were just offloaded. Those which were destined for Israel would have been dumped, wouldn't have arrived in Israel. And I spent 3 or 4 trips going to Libya, and this was pre-Gaddafi. It was King Idris. It was a kingdom then, and I got to know Libya exceptionally well. And I in fact did locate many of the bikes in Tripoli. And I remember having to go along, and now I'd located them. They were CKD bikes, completely knocked down, 25 bikes in 2 wooden boxes, a frame box and a rim box. And I remember thinking, gosh, and I must have found about 12 to 15,000, I can't remember exactly, in the ports in Tripoli. And I then had to go around and I visited all the dealers. And then I thought the dealers were interested. And I think we'd been paid by ECGD or some insurance, I suppose. I can't remember. I don't know how they handled that financially. But I had the bills of lading and I had all the documents in my name personally. So I owned these bicycles. And I remember seeing the dealers, and some of them were interested, but obviously wanted to see the goods first. And I thought, and I had to bring them to their shop. And I remember thinking, how on earth am I going to get there? And there were no such things as forklift trucks. And I remember going along, and I hired a donkey and cart. I took it into the port, loaded 2 bikes, 25 bikes, frame set and rim set, went down with that donkey and cart to the shops and sold them, got the money and in cash, and then went straight to the bank with tethering my donkey outside the bank. And Tripoli, by the way, is a very sophisticated city. It's not it's a lovely city. So that was my first job.
Interesting that you were personally responsible for these bikes as well, because that sort of echoes something which struck me when I was researching George Wilson and the involvement of Raleigh in Ireland, because the Free State government were trying to set up an operation and they didn't want to be beholden to the Brits. And so the link with Raleigh was actually in the personal name of George Wilson, because he, in their eyes, was an Irish citizen, having been born in Dublin. Yeah.
Because he was an Irish citizen.
Extraordinary trust.
Yes. Do you know, I never met George Wilson. He died the year before I joined in a terrible car accident. I met his widow, and I knew his son Glenn very well. And he was, I would think, of all the managing directors and I say this advisedly, he's the one that stands out from 1940 to the present day. What an exceptional man. And the stories that would be told in the workforce there, he would make a point every Monday morning of walking right round that huge complex, and rather like a headmaster in a school, he would know everybody's name. And people always thought of him as the gaffer, and he had a control over that company that was remarkable.
Yes.
Exceptional man.
It really is astonishing. Having read all the minutes from the archives in Nottingham, every one of them that's available, you go through the interwar years, and it really is just so impressive. Raleigh were really on the ball at that time. You had Wilson there with that involvement that you've described, and I think part of that came out of his military background, and having been a military cross in the First World War and that sort of thing. So he'd had his hands dirty, he'd seen terrible things, he'd dealt with all sorts of different people in different circumstances. And you also had the presence of Harold Bowden, who, despite his privileged upbringing, had done a full apprenticeship, and he'd also worked in sales, and he just sort of stayed in the background and didn't say much, but when he did say something, he really knew what was going on, because he, just as you were saying, also walked the factory. And they had these copiously documented minutes every 2 weeks, and you can see that they really were on top of it.
Do you know the irony of that is that here was I coming in under a new regime of trained managers. And it's interesting hearing you say that. We've forgotten just the depth of experience and knowledge, and then education of that. It's gone, hasn't it?
Yes.
And certainly when I came up, there was a lot of people, we talked about Freddie Dingang, who were the ex-generals from the war. Well, they weren't involved in sort of management techniques, but they knew how to get things working, and they knew how to drive people. But you had that but actually that quiet management style of people like George Wilson and, as you said, the family, Bowden family, and so on. What depth there was, and what love, and what connection with all of the people. And although it was paternal, it was loved. And the things that were done then, I remember all the infrastructure in Raleigh was not about making bikes. They knew the parents' name and the thing, and there was the Coach Road had its cricket grounds and bowling clubs. There was dance clubs. It was enormous. It was a complete empire, actually, and it was done for the people so that they were taken care of.
Yes.
And people think now, what were they paid? Oh, I was only paid 5 shillings when I was a boy. But actually, they were having a lifestyle that was very privileged. And I think we've lost a lot since you recall that.
And one of the things that's particularly striking, and I've never seen it highlighted, but it is a fact that they never, ever in their documentation over decades referred to workers. They always said work people, and that's such a deep psychological thing. They were seeing people as people, and it just was not in the vocabulary. You never see it in the minutes or anything like that. They never talk about our workers. They talk about our work people.
Yes, how interesting. Well, it was interesting too, because in my 2 years where I was sort of doing this graduate traineeship, we had to work 6 months on the factory floor, actually. And again, that's a practice on. And there was 2 things I did which I remember. I remember having to build a wheel. My goodness. I gained an appreciation of wheel builders after that, because I can tell you now, after a full day of trying, I was incapable of building a bicycle wheel. How simple can you get that? But in fact, it's not easy. And then it was interesting too, because I was involved in Holland mechanics in a later life, and automatic wheel building and so on. And one of the places we were building wheels faster than the Holland mechanics wheel building machines was in Huffy in America. Their productivity was so high, and I went to see them building wheels, and it stayed with me because I had tried to build a wheel once in my life and failed, and I knew what was involved because it got me. And this appreciation you got of the working man and all about him really, because you'd worked alongside him.
Yeah.
And I wonder how we will ever replace that.
Yes. It is extraordinary. Yeah. So you've been in Libya and you've had your donkey and you've got some bikes back. What happened after that, John?
I very much went into export, and I think I became a bit of a troubleshooter for going overseas, because I covered the Middle East for Raleigh, and I spent most of my time travelling, actually. Our trips, by the way, were never less really than 6 weeks. If you went for 3 months, you were allowed to take your wife, if you still have one, with you. But so my trips were I wasn't married, but 6 weeks duration. One of the trips I used to start in Afghanistan and do Kabul and go down to then Herat, go on from Herat to Tehran, do Iran, and then from Tehran to Baghdad, Baghdad down to Basra, Basra Kuwait, Kuwait to Abu Dhabi, Abu Dhabi to Bahrain, I can't remember them all the way to Oman, end up in Lebanon.
Wow.
Yes, and then home, and that was a 6-week trip, taking orders, and that was that. So I covered the Middle East for a while, and then I got involved because of my African experience in some of the things in East Africa after that, and so I had a good session actually travelling on the Middle East mainly. The politics has reared up in all our lives these days. Independence hadn't quite brought the wealth to the African that they had anticipated, and they suddenly realised when the Brits had gone and tried to help that, of course, the place was really being run by the Indians. And we had this wonderful policy of localisation, I think it was called. Well, at the time, Raleigh had about 85% of the East African market, and we were suddenly told that when all of our dealers were of Indian origin, one sort or another, and we could foresee that the market was going to decline, and B, the fabulous thing about there is that all our bikes were either in black or in Raleigh green, and they were only of two sizes, 23-inch big ones and 21-inch smaller ones, but we sold something like 60,000 bikes to East Africa. And of course that kept the elephant in Nottingham really fed, one of the big areas, and I was asked to go over there and support, try and hold up the Raleigh market there for as long as we could while they changed the factory round. And this is something I got involved in more and more. So the first job I then had, I went to work for Raleigh East Africa, and interesting enough, again, only someone like Jimmy could have done this, but I went to work for the KNTC, the Kenya National Trading Corporation. Fascinating. Had 200 people. I was the only non-African working for it. Yeah, and one of its job was to give trading licenses, and I was actually a signatory in Kenya to people getting a trading license, and of course all the Asians on had to get their trading license renewed, and of course when it had an Asian name on it, that was always delayed and what have you. And my job was to try and help local Africans, to bring them up, to talk to them, teach them. And I said, now, really, what did I know? I said, from history and getting bicycles off the port. Here was I suddenly talking to people doing real business. And I had to teach Africans to come up in business in East Africa. So I worked for the Kenya National Trading Corporation, and I think I can say that I don't think I succeeded that well, but I did certainly succeed in keeping Raleigh's market afloat for probably 12 months longer than it would have happened, because sure enough, soon after I left, the market went right down, and then hard on the heels it went to India, where the prices were, something like not half the price, but about 25% of the price of a Raleigh. Right. So very sad to have a lot of experiences in East Africa, and I lived in East Africa, in fact, for two years. And then, preempting your next question, we were going to build a factory in Tanganyika, which had then become Tanzania. I often think we've lost something having these new names, because actually it's Tanzania because it was the union of Zanzibar and Tanganyika became Tanzania. Well, I wasn't in Zanzibar, I was in Tanganyika. Anyway, we were building a factory there, and it was going to be put into Morogoro, which is about 100 miles west of Dar es Salaam. So I was situated in Dar es Salaam, by this time working for the National Development Corporation, very august body, and that was the biggest market. We was, of the 60,000 bikes, we were perhaps selling 40,000, something like that, in Tanzania. And so I went to see Morogoro, quite the wrong place, no doubt about it. And of course it turned out it was a political decision made by the locals. And it wasn't long before I thought, well, there's no way we will have a local factory in Morogoro. It wasn't Dar es Salaam, which had at least been a port. It wasn't central to East Africa. Remember, East Africa really was a unit still in those days. And so I managed to get it changed from Morogoro to Moshi. Now, Moshi is by Arusha, which is on the slopes of Kilimanjaro, right on the border of Kenya. Fabulous. And so I spent, a good year there, setting up, or beginning to set up our factory, and working with the State Trading Corporation to distribute bicycles, most of which were Raleigh when I arrived. However, politics again, the local politicians had fallen in love, particularly in Tanzania, with China at the time. Julius Nyerere, whom I got to know, and I knew his brother very well, funnily enough, who was a nobody, which I'm going to divert an awful story. I remember Jimmy Cummings saying to me, he gave me when I went to Nairobi for the first time, he gave me no advice on what to do. I was told my job, but I wasn't told how to conduct myself. And I remember he said to me, "Now, John, I'll tell you one thing before you go. Never be rude to the sweeper. He might be the president's brother." Well, do you know, Julius Nyerere's brother was a nobody, charming man, and held me in good stead. Not that I would have ever been rude to the sweeper, I hope, but just an interesting little point. Yeah. But of course, at that time, they were, the little red book of Mouts was being distributed in Dar es Salaam when I was there. Of course, they decided they were going to build the Tanzam Railway, and they started the railway from between Dar es Salaam and Lusaka. A total white elephant, of course. But in order to sort of pay for it, the only thing that China produced that Tanzania consumed was bicycles. And the first I knew that I got wind of this and immediately said, "Look, come on, if you want us to build a factory." And NDC was saying to me, no, we've agreed this and you will be protected and the rest of it. But I was also working with a state trading company. One was on the left hand of Mr. Nyerere, or President Nyerere, and one was on the right hand. And I had wind that they had ordered some bikes. And I went up to Tanga, north of Dar, and filmed the first load of bikes coming in from China. Having filmed it, taken pictures of it, I went back to do battle in Dar es Salaam, and I was dispatched out of the country 1 week later.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, they had decided to buy bikes from China, and we aborted the factory. It was...
Goodness me, yes. Yes, quite. So these were what, flying pigeon bikes coming in?
Do you know, I don't know what they were branded. Flying Pigeon, each state in China has its own brand. So 5 Rams comes from the Guangzhou area. Right. Flying Pigeon is actually north for Beijing. So it probably was Flying Pigeon because the Beijing, I think they made in Tianjin, aren't they, Flying Pigeon? Yeah. So it probably did come from that area. But each different state has its own brand names. Yeah. So it probably was Flying Pigeon.
So you were kicked out of there, and what happened next?
Well, then, extraordinary break. I found it very difficult getting back into Nottingham. I have to say that it was. I found it hard because, believe it or not, despite I had thought I was going to spend a lifetime in East Africa. I'd learnt to fly. I'd learnt to speak Swahili, and I was absolutely engrossed in it. Loved it. So I went back, and I thought, God, how am I going to survive? And I again was, in no man's land, but I went to work for Sturmey-Archer, which was just a division, for a remarkable man, again, one of those humble, unsung heroes, a chap called Ray Bakewell, an exceptionally bright, ordinary bloke who had at his fingertips commerce and business and the detail of it that was truly humbling, because by this time I'd got a bit of a big head. I was, running around Africa as a somebody, or thinking I was, coming back and then meeting people like him probably was the best thing I might have done on reflection, because what a super guy. Would never be mentioned in any books, but my word, everybody would refer to him. He was the commercial in charge of Sturmey-Archer, and a huge turnover. I mean, Sturmey-Archer was selling about £35 million worth of hubs around the world. And what a lucky break for me, because it was through working with Ray Bakewell that I was introduced to the other manufacturers, because, of course, Sturmey-Archer was being sold to all the manufacturers of bicycles in the world. And so I worked for him for at least a couple of years. And then it was, after that, funnily enough, they were looking at, and I worked for Sturmey-Archer, and I won't say I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was very humbling, and it was jolly hard work. It really was, because getting to know and understand Sturmey-Archer, it's got a lot about it, and you have to understand the engineering, and it was a world that actually I'd got married too, so I was a bit more settled, and I must admit that it was important days, and reflection in the bicycle business, perhaps valuable But I was there for a couple of years when, blow me down, Tube Investments were buying Lines Brothers.
Ah.
And, of course, they had a big problem in Australia. And there it was that it was decided that Raleigh, unbelievable really, in Australia, Raleigh was not known. Raleigh had its own brands, a company called General Accessories, and had Speedwell and Malvern Star were the two local brand names. And Raleigh didn't really feature there at all. And interestingly enough, that's where I got to meet David Duffield from the home market. He was a home market man, and he was sent out to Australia actually first. But he didn't want to stay out there. But I was then offered, after he'd been there for a very short time, and they knew he wasn't going to stay out, to set up Raleigh Australia. So I spent 3 extraordinary months working with David side by side, and saw what a dynamo he was. Gosh, and he's talk about riding bicycles. I mean, he slept with his bicycles and bicycle, and he would be doing 100 miles before breakfast every morning and putting in a day's work. I didn't know how he did it, and I was out there, and then I started Raleigh Australia. And David went back, and then I was put in charge of that. And then we got put down to, I was in Melbourne with David, and although we were travelling interstate, it was Melbourne that was the head office, and we were involved with Johnson's and Pilgrim golf buggies and Johnson's baby carriages. So I was involved with golf buggies, which was nice, and these prams, which was also quite fascinating and quite interesting, real Aussie people, entrepreneurial people. But then we bought Lines Brothers, TI bought them, and I was suddenly sent from Melbourne to Sydney, where the Cyclops was the Lines Brothers toy manufacturer. Now, Cyclops, to any Australian over the age of 40, it was the name, just as we would know Trying or whatever. Cyclops was the funny name. But that started in 1915 in Leichhardt in New South Wales. So after some 4 or 5 months, I went to be based in Sydney, and I spent 3 years setting up Raleigh in Australia.
Right, and David, of course, had been with TI before the merger with Raleigh, and he'd left.
He was a Forbes man.
Yes, he'd left at that time of the merger when he saw that Raleigh was going to be in command, and then had come back after his time with Moulton, and then a year or two outside the industry altogether, didn't he?
Yes, you're precisely right. No, it was fascinating to meet, because our paths hadn't crossed at all. But extraordinary how these strands come into your life when you're in industry. Meeting someone as rounded and, of course, as accomplished in the cycle world was news to me. And although I spoke disparagingly about my efforts on a bicycle, it was really through David that I got not only to appreciate cycling. I mean, it was jolly hard work as far as I could see, and the pleasure side was not very high. But funnily enough, I got involved, of course, because being Raleigh out there, we had to cycle, we had to sponsor cycles. And I remember he was telling me, don't get a team, John, because in cycling, they're only interested in the winner. And I remember I actually employed, funnily enough, Gordon Johnson as my sales rep for Victoria. Right. And, of course, he was world champion in 1970, about then anyway, wasn't he? And I got to know about cyclists, and it wasn't very charming what I got to know, because of Gordon, who's a wonderful character. He used to tell me of his races, particularly in Italy, where they would brook no opposition. I mean, it was elbows and the lot. But they are a breed apart, cyclists, racing cyclists. I learnt from David a bit, but certainly from Gordon Johnson, because being Australian, Australians, as you know, they want to win, and whether it's cricket or whatever. And Gordon Johnson was one of those. But I remember going through, training him up as a sales rep and going through all the planned selling methods that we used to have to learn, pre-approach, approach, presentation, close, going into the dealer's shop, making him summarise first what the window display was like, what we wanted to get out of the shop before we went in, have you had a look at his accounts, had he paid up, do all your homework, training these guys, going into the shop, looking at the display, deciding where the gaps were and where you were last time. And I went in and I gave a demonstration of how you should go about selling. And Gordon Johnson, I was in there for about 40 minutes, and we went in and we got an order for 8 bikes. Got back in the car, and Gordon said, "Geez, John," he said, "I've left my bloody pencil in there." So I said, "God," and I went for him. He said, "I won't be a sec." He went in there, and of course, 5 minutes later, he comes out, "Got an order for 2 more bikes, mate." Never forgot that. Bastard. Anyway, sorry, another diversion. But I did actually go on to sponsor Raleigh in the races. And do you know, one of the difficulties in Australia, you choose a winner, and when he wins locally, what does he dream of doing? Shoots off to Europe. And I've been warned about this, and I can't remember his name. I got a chappie, and a delightful young man. He was a carpet fitter by trade, and what a good cyclist. And I'd sort of followed his form for a bit, and what I liked about him, he was always in the top, so usually in the top 3. Rarely was he first, and I thought, that's the kind of guy I want. Someone who's got something to go for. So, I wish I could remember his name. And I wasn't put money into cycling is usually, a bit of a folly. There's not usually a much return on it. I speak out of school here, really, but it's a difficult one. But to put your name up and have it featured is important as well. So I got this one man to be my guy, and he had a charming wife, and again a very Aussie thing. And I was debating, how much he would cost. I was trying to do the sums in my head, and I went down with one of the toy reps. I'm trying to remember his name. Laz Ferenz, his name was. Laz Ferenz. Yeah. And I was chatting to this chap in the bar, and Laz was there. And he said, "Sign him up, John." And I said, "Why do you say that? You don't know anything about him." He said, "I don't need to." He said, "You sign him up." He said, "Have you seen his missus?" He said, "Shh, look at her. Bloody fabulous." He said, "You won't go wrong. Sign him up." Typical Australian. And I did. And again, one of the funny things, not only did he came second for a few times, he started winning. He then went over to Europe. Funny enough, I'm sure I remember his name because you'd know it. And but of course, one of his biggest assets was his gorgeous wife, who appeared everywhere. Wow. So Raleigh did become well known. Yes. My years in Australia.
Goodness me.
Enough of Australia.